Action, suspense, tragedy, romance. The epic conclusion to THQ's long road to failure has everything. What other news story from this year had as many highs and lows as the collapse of this giant super publisher? Following this company's failure from November and onwards had me at the edge of my seat, and it influenced the tone of previous videos to the plans I have for the future. And it was a real roller coaster ride, full of hope and sympathy one moment to frustration and regret the next. And it was actually kind of a bit of a mess. It might be a bit of a misconception to think that this story had one particular catalyst that caused this company to fall. It's not really fair to assume that this company's demise came as a result of one particular trend or event. It was more like a perfect storm of terrible trends and events. Bad decisions were made by many people from many levels, but it's important to understand the context within which these decisions were made. THQ is an old company, and its history saw it releasing games that looked like this, to games that ended up looking like this within a 10-year time span. And just looking at these two titles shows that there was something kind of off-putting about the brand. Something kind of trashy and kind of low class. They also did dirt bikes and wrestling, and they did fairly well with those kinds of games until the past 5 years or so, but their inability to pick up the pace shows a shift in the industry that was beyond their control. Unfortunately, it also represents their inability to adapt to a changing market over time. But to trace the company's problems back to their roots, you have to rewind time all the way back to the Great Recession of 2008. Just 1 year earlier in 2007, they were riding high with a reported revenue of over $1 billion, which put them neck and neck in competition with EA and Activision. But in 2008, they saw a $35 million loss. For some reason, their forte, which was licensed kids games and white trash sports, wasn't doing as well as it had the year before. As free alternatives for kids games began cropping up online and on phones, THQ reacted with a wave of layoffs. They closed down Paradigm Entertainment, who were the guys who made Stuntman Ignition and Juice 2, hot import nights. They also closed Mass Media, Helix, Locomotive Games, and Sandblast Games, who were all producers of Pixar-licensed kids titles that were oftentimes developed for portables. According to their end-of-the-year report, they decided to put faith in a stronger, more hardcore lineup for 2009. But in 2009, sales continued to decline, and the price of THQ shares dropped by 86%. They continued to trim off developers who made licensed Pixar and Nickelodeon titles, and instead of closing down Heavy Iron and Incinerator Studios, they had the decency to let them go independent. But the guys who made Rise of Nations got sold to Kurt Schilling's studio and got to work on Kingdoms of Amalur, which would turn into a failed plan a few years later. At the end of 2009, THQ reported a much bigger loss than last time. This time it was $191 million, and so it was that they laid off 600 workers. In 2010, THQ unveiled the U-Draw tablet, a product that no one asked for and no one wanted. At $70 it was considered overpriced, but thanks to a moderately successful lineup of licensed Wii Kids games for the accessory, it actually started out as a sleeper success. But only for a while. So Metro 2033 came out, and despite being a kick-ass game, it was a bit too rushed to have the polish needed to become the next big thing. After a few patches, it eventually achieved cult status and broke even in the long run, but THQ nevertheless ended 2010 on a lukewarm note, with a minor turnaround. But next year, things went to shit. For some reason, THQ suddenly decided to push the U-Draw as hard as it could in 2011, and made new versions of the Drawy tablet for the other two consoles. It was overproduced, overpriced, undermarketed, and undersold. The commercial failure of this thing arguably crippled the whole company, and according to one interview from last year, there were apparently more than 1 million of these just lying around unused and unsold in a warehouse somewhere. THQ bet big on this thing, and while it kinda sorta broke even on the Wii with its younger and more casual audience, I still don't know how they expected to sell this toy on the other consoles. So they sold off their mobile studios to the Swedish, they changed the logo, and they also made Homefront. This game came out during the aftermath of the entire First World blowing their disposable income on Call of Duty Black Ops. And so, of course, it also came out in the middle of a very vocal and rousing backlash against Call of Duty Black Ops. Homefront seemed to evoke everything that was bad about Black Ops and didn't do much good to improve on it either. It didn't appeal to either the haters or the fans. But what's more important is that they needed to sell a staggering 2 million units of this game just to break even. Assuming that they made that estimate at a $60 price tag, then that means that this game would have had to earn back $120 million to the industry that made it. That number doesn't mean that that's how much this game costs to produce, but it does represent the overall industry effort of manufacturing, distribution, retail sales work, and especially marketing that went into this game. They built up a huge hype for it, and it turned out to be a big critical and commercial flop. I don't get it. THQ, much like the other three big publishers it was trying to compete with, had fostered this delusional idea that somehow spending millions of dollars on marketing for a bad game means that millions would be sold in retail. But holy shit, believe it or not, games are kinda a little bit expensive. People don't buy them with the same kind of subconscious casual whim that they buy junk food. Review scores, word of mouth, and the overall quality of a game is what's supposed to sell the product. Not the tasteless, backfiring PR stunts, or how many times you can squeeze a game commercial in between Cialis. The year ended on a more positive note after the release of Saints Row III, which sold over 4 million copies by the end of the year and effectively made good on one more unfortunately inflated budget. Even though the game was kind of a downgrade from the previous installment and raked in almost double the revenue, that didn't stop THQ from aggressively marketing an embarrassing overabundance of paid DLC trinkets. They started the whole DLC Season Pass thing with this game, which would charge customers another $20 on top of the $60 game. Perhaps this was more of a move of desperation than greed. THQ trimmed more license fat, letting Blue Tongue Studios go. They also began nixing their own franchises, and closed down the studios responsible for their long-running dirt biking series. And even though the Red Faction series went through a nice reboot a bit earlier, THQ decided to stop making those games after a disappointing sequel. Maybe it was also because the TV show was just too embarrassing to live with.
Tell me about your family.
I'm not much of a talker.
THQ ended 2011 with the biggest loss ever, clocking in at a total of $239 million. Once again, company president Danny Bilson promised to step away from licensed kids games to focus on more core titles, which I guess are games that require more money and creativity to cook up. So in March of 2012, the Warhammer MMO got cancelled and 100 employees got laid off. In May, Danny Bilson stepped down in the middle of this perfect storm of failed projects. The company was screwed beyond repair, and the guy tasked with replacing him and picking up the pieces was the Naughty Dog founder, Jason Rubin. A month later, Rubin gave EA the rights to UFC. A month after that, the company's stock was so cheap that they had to do a reverse share split with shareholders to keep it from being delisted off the NASDAQ. What this basically means is that the shareholders had to all agree to reduce the total amount of THQ shares on the market to 1/10 of what was there before, thereby increasing the value of individual shares. Another over-budgeted 2 million marker game failed to break even, and this time it was Darksiders 2. The beginning of the end came in November when the company defaulted on a $50 million Wells Fargo loan, and with a total loss of up to $250 million, their stock price plummeted. THQ reacted by delaying games. The next batch of games would be delayed till April 2013, and Jack Rubin issued an optimistic statement about the delay, putting faith in the developers to use the time to polish those games to a mirror shine. Their second move was an unprecedented Humble Bundle sale, where THQ sold a huge pack of their own games at whatever price consumers were willing to name for them. It was crazy! You had a 7-pack of all these games with the over-budgeted budgets and the shiny, expensive graphics, and you could buy them for next to nothing! It was an unprecedented and controversial move and a total contradiction of the Humble Bundle's previous mission statement, but it was still a beautifully effective PR stunt. Suddenly, people saw this big evil corporation really bending over backwards to win over customers, and people actually became sympathetic for them. Just a few days later, they actually started giving away Metro for free. Raising funds to save THQ was suddenly considered a charitable cause. The biggest single purchaser of the bundle put down $11,050, and it was made by none other than the new company president, Jason Rubin. The sale ultimately raised them $5 million, which was a record breaker by Humble Bundle standards, but just a drop in the bucket compared to the debt they had to pay off. They still had hundreds of millions of dollars they couldn't show for, and about a week after the sale ended, they filed for bankruptcy and planned to sell the company assets to a group called Clear Lake Capital. For a couple weeks, business continued as usual until the bankruptcy judge blocked the sale in the name of capitalism. You see, when a company files for Chapter 11, they have to sell off all of their own assets to make enough money to pay back the debt that bankrupted them in the first place. A government court is supposed to oversee this process and make sure that the company can make back on its debt, but THQ's particular judge was citing complaints from other parties that were interested in buying up THQ's game projects. You see, just before they went bankrupt, THQ signed a non-disclosure deal with Clearlake Capital, meaning that neither party could announce that the company was going to be for sale even though they knew they were going to go bankrupt. According to Judge Mary Walrath, that of course was not a fair deal to everyone else. There were supposedly 10 other parties interested in buying up THQ's assets, and the competition of an auction was supposed to drive up prices higher than if they'd quietly sold themselves to Clearlake Capital, thus enabling them to better pay off their debt. So just a couple weeks ago, the games they delayed in November got auctioned off to the highest bidder one by one. Company of Heroes got sent off to Sega, who might actually be a pretty good fit. They've done a pretty good job cultivating a similar brand under the Total War series. The Metro and Saints Row developers got sent off to Koch Media, who have dipped their fingers in all sorts of franchises ranging in quality from Dead Island to Prison Break. The development for the next Metro game should have been complete around the time they made the sale to Koch. But for the next Saints Row game, the development budget is probably going to be a good deal smaller than it would have if they were under THQ. But then again, Saints Row is a pretty powerful brand name, and it just might be enough to boost Koch up to the next level. South Park went to Ubisoft and Wrestling got sold to Take-Two Interactive, and both of those publishers may actually have the budget to just continue business as normal. The Darksiders developers were sadly laid off, and despite the original studio house closing long ago, the almost poisonous Homefront IP has been sold to Crytek, who put some other laid-off staff at work in Austin. Strangely enough, no one wanted to buy Warhammer, and neither EA nor Warner Brothers were interested in buying any of THQ's leftovers at all. But the price that these franchises were being auctioned off for was dirt cheap, and the companies that bought them up now get to release a near-complete AAA game for a fraction of the cost, and that's some serious profit margin. What remains to be seen though is how well they can foster these brands for the future. What this failure represents overall though is that cheap licensed games aren't going to make it anymore. In the middle of 2011, THQ was repeatedly promising to back off on the licensed kids games, while at the same time trying really hard to push an accessory that almost exclusively supported licensed kids games. It's almost anachronistic, like they were doing business from 10 years ago. Focusing on developing and marketing single installments of kids franchises means that you have to compete with the free stuff found on Facebook and cell phones. But maybe the background of the former president explains it. Bilson was a transmedia mogul who had extensive experience working in the production of cross-media comic books and movies. Maybe that explains why they had such a hard time getting away from licenses. But at the same time, making a deal with WWE and UFC had to have been really expensive and binding as well. 10 years ago, EA was going the same route and almost exclusively produced crappy licensed movie games, but at some point around 2008, they started to work on their own core IPs that they could then safely milk to death over the next few years. While making a spirited attempt at the same process, THQ failed to fully make that transition. They also might have been a bit deluded to think that they could compete with EA in the first place. But that was just one problem in a sea of mismanagement problems. They got all mixed up in these long-lasting and expensive licenses that lost more and more value as this decade went on. But they also devalued their own properties, and lost a lot of potential by not taking another stab at Red Faction, or just spending more time polishing their wrestling and ATV games. But maybe it was inevitable. AAA games development these days is an incredibly risky venture, and you can't put as much money behind mediocre licensed shovelware as you could before. People caught on to that crap. It doesn't work anymore. THQ's failure is evidence of it. It's just a shame that a few more of their actually enjoyable games got mixed up in their management. Some great series were discontinued and some others were sent to less worthy foster homes. I guess the best we can do is just hope that these survivors end up okay.